Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
Well, good evening and welcome to Eye on the Storm, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it could impact you. I'm CBS 17 meteorologist Brian Hutton Jr. in Raleigh, North Carolina. Tonight, we've got a great show ahead as I'll be joined by one of our own CBS 17 reporters and a meteorologist down in Mobile, Alabama, as we go back to the 2004 hurricane season. During tonight's show, if there is anything you would like to know or subjects you would like for us to talk about tonight or in the coming weeks, please email us at sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address, so let us hear from you. As we're getting in touch with our panel tonight directly, the best way to do that is on social media. On Twitter, you'll find me at BrianWX with Brian Hutton Jr., same thing on Facebook as well. Facebook, WKRG's Thomas Gieboy is at Thomas Gieboy WX, and our own CBS 17's Holden Krawicki is at Holden Krawicki CBS 17. Now, before we get to our guests, let's jump right in talking about what's happening now in the tropics. And it is an active one now. It's been quiet for the last several weeks. I don't think anybody is complaining that we've had a slow start to the 2019 hurricane season, but we should expect activity to pick up this time of year. That's not a surprise. We're approaching the peak of hurricane season. The peak is on September 10th climatologically, and of course we're towards the end of August, so we should expect storms to really start developing over the next couple of weeks. In fact, Dr. Phil Klotzbaugh, who's one of the climatologists and meteorologists at Colorado State, says that about 66% of hurricane activity in the Atlantic occurs between August 20th and October 10th. Today is August 20th, so we are really kind of in the prime time of hurricane season, so we should expect some activity. And there's two things that we're watching across the Atlantic for us this evening. One is a tropical wave that's in the Bahamas. The National Hurricane Center, as of the new update at the top of the hour, gives this a 20% chance of development over the next 5 days. It gives it a 0% chance over the next 2, and it's forecast to move along the coastline of the eastern seaboard near Florida, Georgia, and then towards the Carolina coast. We'll talk more on this in just a minute, especially our Raleigh audience will be interested in what's happening there, and our friends along the southeast coast. The only active storm is this cluster that to the untrained eye and even to the trained eye just looks like a blob out in the middle of the open Atlantic. This is Tropical Storm Chantal, the third named storm of the 2019 hurricane season. It developed last night, kind of to surprise of a lot of us, but here it is nonetheless, and it's really shown weakening signs over the last about 12 to 24 hours or so. And the National Hurricane Center noted in their last forecast advice, which came out a couple of hours ago, that this could become a tropical depression fairly quickly, if not even completely degenerate by that point. Latest advisory has Chantal with winds of 40 miles per hour, so barely tropical storm strength, gusts of 50 with a pressure of 1,009 millibars, and moving to the east at 20 miles per hour. It's forecast to remain tropical storm strength for about another day or so, if that, before it weakens to a tropical depression as it just kind of spins over the open North Atlantic. So it is no threat to land. It's what we call a fish storm, which means it won't impact anybody directly, except for the fish out in the ocean, and they won't feel its impacts either. What is of more concern to not only our audience here in Raleigh, but to those of you at home, no matter where you're watching from this evening, is this cluster, this tropical wave that's here near the Bahamas. This is our infrared satellite picture, and you can notice there's a bit of a swirl trying to develop on the northern side of this. A lot of thunderstorms on the southern end, but there's trying to get a little bit of a swirl developing on the northern side. So we may be trying to see some early stages of development out of the system. It is, again, late August into early September, so this is something we should be watching anyway. Here's a look at water vapor satellite. This is measuring the moisture in the middle levels of the atmosphere. We can kind of see some mid-level features with this, and as we saw on our satellite, you're also seeing here in the mid-levels that they're perhaps trying to get an area of circulation developing here on the northeastern side of the system. Now, when systems are very weak, it's not uncommon for there to be multiple areas of low pressure that try and form. It's not until one becomes dominant that we really start seeing tropical development take off. So we have plenty of time to watch this thing, but it definitely has some moisture. There's no dry air inside the storm. That's kind of the oranges and browns. You can see it's very healthy in terms of moisture, and there's not a lot of shear at the moment near it either. So this could have a chance to try and get itself together. It's something that we are going to have to keep our eyes on. Here's one forecast model. This is the European. We'll start the clock here at the top of the next hour, and this is forecast to slowly move off to the northwest and then turn northward towards Jacksonville and the kind of Big Bend of Georgia there. This is Saturday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A lot of moisture with this sitting just off the Carolina and Georgia coast. coastlines, and this is forecast to continue lifting off to the north and east as well. Notice this model doesn't develop anything. You don't see a closed area of circulation. You don't see that typical ring shape, that circular pattern indicating it's a well-developed tropical storm or a hurricane. But what this could do is bring a lot of moisture along the coastlines. If you're heading down to Georgia beaches, Florida beaches on the Atlantic side, or any of the Carolina beaches, it could mean additional rainfall this weekend. Not good news if you're trying to get in the last blast of summer, as a lot of kids starting to head back to school across the deep south. But that is something that we'll keep an eye on. As far as what's in favor of this system, we look for a lot of ingredients to kind of line up for us to get tropical development. One of those is we need warm ocean water. We need temperatures of at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer to get a tropical system to develop. Well, that's one thing this thing has for it. Again, that's where it's situated now. This is ocean temperatures, and where it's going is going to be right over top of the Gulf Stream, which is the really warm portion of water that moves along the eastern seaboard and then heads back out to the open Atlantic, where it starts to fizzle out as it mixes out. And there's a lot of warm water over the Bahamas. Of course, the shelf, the bottom of the ocean is fairly shallow here, so it has a chance to really warm up. And then as it heads off to the north and east, there's a lot of warm water in its path, so that's a positive for development, as there's a lot of warm ocean water. What's a negative is any type of wind shear, especially as the system develops. Now, wind shear is simply either the turning of winds with height or increased changing speed with height. And right now, where it's sitting, there's some shear on the northern side, but right now, a fairly light shear out ahead of it. If we look forward in time, there's some areas of shear, but as we get into Sunday, as this thing would probably likely be off the coast of Wilmington area per se, or perhaps out towards Hatteras, shear increases as the jet stream dips southward. So if this thing tries to develop, by the time we get into Sunday and Monday, it would be grabbed by the jet stream, kicked out to sea, and probably torn apart. So that's the good news. The bad news is the water is warm, and right now shear is light, but it hasn't really developed into anything yet. But it's something we're keeping our eyes on. It is, again, heading towards the peak of the season, so anything, especially this close to home, and something that will be close to the mainland U.S., is something definitely worth noting. So ocean water, a positive, shear, kind of So we'll definitely have to keep an eye on the system as we move forward in time over the next couple of days. Something that our viewers here in North Carolina are familiar with, Florence. This was last year's track, of course, caused a lot of flooding problems across the Carolinas, not just in North Carolina, but also down in the South Carolina. But one of our own was actually situated along the coast. So let's jump in now to a live look at Wrightsville Beach here in North Carolina. With that, I'll welcome in our first guest, CBS 17 reporter Holden Kurwicki. Now, Holden, you are pretty familiar with Wrightsville Beach, having reported there quite a bit during and after Hurricane Florence. Take us through what we don't see, the behind-the-scenes action to actually get on the air.
Well, it was really something that, I hate to quote Charles Dickens here, but it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. As soon as our management asked me to go down there, I knew I had to go. I lived in Wilmington for a couple of years, but I really didn't know what to expect. I've covered a couple of tropical storms before, but really nothing like Hurricane Florence. Admittedly, I was really worried as it headed toward shore, because there for a while, I believe it was a Category 4 storm. And me, growing up in the Midwest, that really concerned me. But the one thing that, as it kind of started rolling in, was it came in waves. You would see those outer bands, almost like on this little graphic that we had, as they would kind of come, you're like, this isn't too bad. This isn't too bad. But if you look at me here, you can see, just look at this telephone pole and how the wind and all of the rain just slowly wore that away. And like I said, I grew up in the Midwest, so you hear a lot of things about things like this, telephone poles just being blown over, or you would see straw through telephone poles. I was like, you don't believe too much about stuff like that. As I was doing one of these live shots, I physically saw a telephone pole bend, kind of like, you would a straw at a restaurant, and it really was terrifying, and it was just unrelenting. That storm was so slow moving that I even told Wes Hohenstein at one time, actually it may have been during one of these shots, the wind was blowing in, and I'd never felt rain like that because it was blowing so hard. It really just felt like needles hitting your skin. This is actually the Cape Fear River, and the interesting thing about that, it was so much from the storm surge, it was pushing the Cape Fear River backwards. I had never seen that. Even when I lived in Wilmington, a couple times you would get some lunar tides. I had just never seen anything like the Cape Fear River flowing backwards. And, it was just went from beautiful, almost like this, to that river flowing backwards, which really within a matter of hours, and then it was like that for days. The hotel we stayed in, we were there for 5 days. I slept in 4 different rooms. It blew the roof off the hotel. And it wasn't just reporters like me. There were national correspondents. David Begnaud actually hitched a ride with us to stay at our hotel because their hotel simply had to be closed down due to all the damage. And it was just, you know, an experience unlike any other. And I remember going to bed that first night thinking, it's not too bad outside. And then as the night went on, you could feel the hotel just kind of rocking. And when I woke up the next day, the entire tree line outside of our hotel had been blown over. It was almost as if, you know, you just take a soda can and push it over. That's what the wind and the rain had really done to all of the trees outside. The only thing I can really equate it to is you see videos of, you know, Europe during World War II, and a lot of the trees are blown off. It was just like that. And the scary thing was, you know, I was doing nighttime coverage. We would try and take shelter at the county government center during the nighttime. But if you got out and drove around in some of these areas, you didn't know from really hour to hour what it was going to be like. It may be clear 1 hour, the next hour it may have been flooded over. An hour after that, you may have found a tree in the road. There were many trees down all over throughout that area. But the scariest thing, obviously we lost power for multiple days, and we run off of, you know, our cameras, we have batteries, we have everything that has to be charged. Well, we were having to run our cars 24 hours a day because that's how we were charging our equipment. But the issue was there was no gas. The roads in and out of Wilmington had been washed out. We were stranded. I mean, Wilmington is an archipelago anyway, and then it turned it in essentially to an island due to all of the flooding. And that was really the worst part of, you know, all this, was trying to figure out, you know, how are we going to get to our next meal? How are we going to get gas? How are we going to make it through the day with our live equipment? And it really got very bare bones really quickly. You know, we always joke about the Waffle House meter. They closed up shop pretty quickly. That was on, I believe, day 2. So it was 5 more days of, you know, really eating Gatorade or drinking Gatorade and, you know, eating whatever, you know, provisions we brought with us. Next time, for sure, I'm going to be stocking up on some MREs, just like the military does, because in a situation like that, it gets pretty drastic, pretty serious.
Right, and that's, you know it's bad when Waffle House closes down. You're right, that is the meter. Now, you know, a lot of times, people probably at home probably wonder this too. You know, we see the reports of people out on the beach, and you know, a famous meteorologist from the Weather Channel is famous for, you know, bending in with the wind. Was it really that bad while you were down there with Wilmington? Now, obviously, Florence was weakening at the time, but was it similar to that? Was that what you expected?
I'm about a 185, 190-pound guy, and at one point, a wind gust grabbed me and picked me up and threw me into my photographer, George Umbenhauer. And he's about my size, too. And we were holding on to each other for dear life because that was the scary part. Actually, that Weather Channel reporter that you were just mentioning, he was not far down from where this was shot. And, of course, there is a famous meme online of him doing that. It was windy. Those wind tunnels, it's weird because in one spot it might not be too bad, but the way the wind funnels around through the trees and even through some of the houses, in one spot it could be fine. And even there, you just saw, you know, how it flipped up my jacket there, and you know, there was another shot of it blowing off my hat. It was just weird how from spot to spot it could be completely calm to in another spot you didn't know how you were really going to stand up very well. And I had rubber boots on, so I was sliding around a little bit, but it was just interesting to see, like I said, just from different parts of town and different areas, maybe within the same location, it could be perfectly fine and semi-calm in one location and another one. Like I said, I saw a telephone pole just bend in a way that I got scared. I'm not going to lie on that one, Brian.
So, you know, seeing that damage firsthand, you know, we get a lot of stories. I'm sure you could probably even share some when you were in Wilmington there with Florence of people who decide, I'm just going to ride it out. It's not going to be that bad. What advice would you give to residents along the coast debating leaving or not as a hurricane's approaching? If you
have friends or family inland and you can, you know, back up out of that and really just get to a safe place and ride the storm out for a couple days, go ahead and do that. But the problem was, especially with this storm, it was so slow moving, a lot of people who got out couldn't get back in. And that was our issue was, you know, we were trying to get out to get back to Raleigh. It's only about a, 2 hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on how fast you drive. But the problem was the interstates were washed out. The back roads were washed out. And, you know, a fellow colleague of mine, Kristen Ketchell at the time, She saw dogs being stranded, and that was what really struck her the most. Was, you know, we all have compassion for one another, but it was seeing those helpless animals that were just left behind. And there were a lot of powerful images of things like that, where, you know, people thought for a while, okay, we can make this, because as I mentioned, really the first few days weren't too bad, but as that storm really just kind of hovered overhead and weakened, that's when the waters really came up in ways that they never had before, in areas that they hadn't come up before. So people last minute had to get out. You saw the Cajun Navy come in and doing a lot of rescues in that area, all the way up to New Bern. So don't put yourself in that situation. There are always those warnings in those hurricane evacuation routes for a reason. Make sure that you give yourself plenty of, you know, just be safe. You know, you don't want to be sorry in one of those situations. Just go ahead and get to safety. That would be my best advice. Honestly, you know, we have run towards it because we want to bring you the latest news. But in this situation, don't be like me. Don't run towards it. Get away from it. Just get somewhere safe and dry, because at the end of the day, your life is worth more than, you know, anything that you may be leaving behind.
Right, yeah, and pets, the number one reason why people decide to stay. Finding a shelter that will house with pets, with some images we see all the time. Holden, thank you for joining us. Some really good stuff there. You can find Holden on Facebook at Holden Kowicki, CBS 17. Fantastic stuff there. I feel like I could just keep asking questions. Really good interview there. So, you know, but that's something that we deal with all the time, as I mentioned, with pets and things like that. So it's not worth taking that risk. And that's something that we've seen time and time again. We're going to jump back now. This year is the 15-year anniversary of the 2004 hurricane season, which for those in North Carolina who are watching will probably remember fairly well. We got crisscrossed by about 6 of these that year. Nothing that was really, no major ones that year, but we got crossed by about 6 of them or so. The first one, Alex, actually just passed offshore. But there was one Category 5 that year. This was actually a fairly active year. There were 15 named storms, 9 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. The biggest one was Hurricane Ivan that became a Category 5 hurricane, the only Category 5 of the year. Now, it didn't make landfall in the U.S. as a Category 5, but it was Category 5 while it was out into the Caribbean. So Ivan was a big one that year. In fact, of that year, prior to the 2005 year, which of course kind of sets all of the records, it was a fairly active year. This is a list of all the retired names from 1954 when we started naming all the way through last year. There are 89 retired names on the list. On the list, 4 of them belong to the 2004 year, which had tied for the most ever until the 2005 season happened, where I believe 6 got retired. So Charlie, which struck Florida, which we just passed Charlie's anniversary. Francis, which actually I think we're at Francis's anniversary. Ivan and Jean. And Ivan was the big baddie of that year, causing a lot of problems. And it did a lot of damage in the portions of Alabama and Florida. So we're going to continue now our coverage with 2004. Let's take a live look here at Orange Beach, Alabama, a spot I know fairly well. It's about an hour west of here. We will find our next guest for us here on Eye on the Storm. Joining us now, WKRG's meteorologist Thomas Gieboy over in Mobile, Alabama. Thomas, thanks for joining us. And let's talk about in terms of the effects Ivan had on the Gulf Coast. So let's start with that storm surge. As our viewers have learned over the last couple of weeks, it's a big factor for those along the coastline.
Well, it is a very big factor for us right along the coastline, and as we've really learned over the last, I would say, 20 years or so, storm surge is really the #1 killer when it comes to tropical systems. Everything is nice and quiet currently in Orange Beach, and that's exactly how we like it. But like you talked about, the 2004 hurricane season, very, very active, and for us along our stretch of the Gulf Coast, the central portion of the Gulf Coast, the only thing that you need to say is Ivan the Terrible. A lot of local folks call it that because that's exactly what it was. Hurricane Ivan, it wasn't your prototypical hurricane where it forms and it lasts for a couple of days and then moves inland and then fades away. It was moving throughout the Atlantic basin for over a week. It formed around September 2nd in the East Atlantic. So we'll go ahead and take this full screen from my director. And you can see as we go with the hurricane path, we got the storm strength, and then you also have it once it moves into a Category 1 hurricane when you go from the greens to the yellows. And as we continued to, or as Ivan continued to track across the Atlantic basin, it crossed the Lesser Antilles, it crossed the Leeward Islands, and then it rapidly intensified as it approached areas such as Venezuela. And another fun fact about Ivan is that it's actually the lowest latitude storm to become a major hurricane for all Category 3, Category 4, and Category 5. It didn't just become a Category 5 hurricane once. It became a Category 5 hurricane south of Haiti and also the Dominican Republic, also known as Hispaniola, that island. And then as it moves toward Jamaica, it became a Category 4 hurricane once again, brushed the island, caused a lot of impacts in those areas in the Caribbean. Then as it shot the gap between the Yucatan Peninsula and also Cuba, became a Category 5 once again, reaching its max intensity of 165 miles per hour. So it was a very strong hurricane, but as it approached the central Gulf of Mexico, that's when we started to see a little bit of weakening, and we really haven't seen it to that point before. But Hurricane Ivan really taught us a little bit about eye wall replacement cycle, because that's exactly what was happening as it was beginning to come on shore, and that allowed things to weaken a little bit. But you're talking about a Category 3 hurricane making landfall, and not only that, it caused a lot of damage extensively inland. And then when you look at the bigger view with Hurricane Ivan, we can go ahead and go back out to me here in the studio, but it also made a loop back around and then impacted areas such as Florida down on the south coast, and then it made a secondary landfall in Louisiana. So Ivan didn't just only impact us, but it impacted a very large stretch of areas that are included in the Atlantic Basin. And just a couple of stats here for us along our stretch of the Gulf Coast. So it made landfall just west of Gulf Shores. It made landfall September 16th at 1:50 in the morning. And anytime we're talking about a major hurricane making landfall during the stages of the overnight, if we could have a landfalling hurricane, the time of day that we would want it would be during the daytime. You don't want to have it that late at night when everything is pitch black. That only adds to rougher conditions there. And when it came ashore, it had winds of 125 miles per hour sustained at landfall. The peak intensity, like we talked about, was 165 mile per hour winds, and it caused extensive damage to the Caribbean. But also, just kind of a fun factoid for the Gulf of Mexico, there were recorded waves in the Gulf of Mexico as it was a Category 5, as a Category 4, that reached over 50 feet. And when you're talking about the Gulf of Mexico, we typically don't see anything close to that. And then when it came ashore, we had storm surge 10 to 15 feet, peak wind gusts of over 140 miles an hour. Now, when we talk about deaths caused by Ivan, that's a little bit tricky, but at least here locally, we cover the farther east, the farthest east extent in terms of Jackson County, Mississippi, all the way over towards Destin, Florida. We didn't have any direct deaths in Alabama or in Mississippi, but in our area in Northwest Florida, there were 8 direct deaths because of Ivan, more than 20 in the U.S., and then more than around 100 total, $14 billion in insured losses, and then at the end, extensive damage inland, mostly from tornadoes, and over 100 tornadoes. So breaking down those local impacts here, we had 15 feet of storm surge. That was mainly from Baldwin County, which includes Orange Beach, Gulf Shores, and then it's in Escambia County, which includes areas such as Pensacola. 145 mile per hour wind gust was measured just north of Orange Beach and Gulf Shores. So you have a Category 4 wind gust because of Hurricane Ivan, and then 15 inches of rainfall. So Ivan, it definitely caused a lot of local impacts, and just kind of breaking it down just a little bit more, you can see that Ivan landfall right over Gulf Shores, Orange Beach. That is something that you don't want to see in a lot of what doesn't get talked about with Ivan, were just how intense some of those rain bands were as well. And when you look at the satellite and radar and look at the radar image, a lot of those rain bands very intense at times and very gusty winds, spawning a lot of tornadoes. And I think at one point we did see, because of the tornado outbreak, over 100 tornadoes. So we talked about the storm surge, and here just kind of some of the list of some of the highest storm surges across our area. Escambia Bay, which is near Pensacola, around 13 feet, and Gulf Breeze around 10 feet, Orange Beach 9 feet, Pensacola 10 feet, Dauphin Island 8 feet. And I have here on my little cheat sheet here that we had near 7 feet of storm surge in Pascagoula and near 5 feet of storm surge in Panama City. So that stretches from the Mississippi Gulf Coast all the way over towards Panama City, which would include where, not just last year, Hurricane Michael made landfall. So it was definitely a strong storm. It's one that we'll never forget. It completely changed the landscape. So, I mean, Hurricane Ivan, it's something that we're always going to remember. So we'll continue on here. And in terms of the rainfall totals, we didn't only see the storm surge, but we also saw a lot of rainfall. This is rainfall totals for 48 hours. In Pensacola, over 15 inches of rain. So within 48 hours, more than 2 feet of rainfall in some locations. In Silver Hill, Alabama, around 10 inches of rain. In Mobile, we saw almost close to 10 inches of rain. In Crestview, Florida, which is in Okaloosa County, which is about, I would say, 50 to 100 miles east of Pensacola, a little bit farther inland, around 8 inches of rain. And then at Evergreen, around 100 miles inland, it was close to 7¼ inches of rainfall, so a lot there. I'm going to ask the director once again to go back to full screen because I also have a couple of graphics that I would like to show in terms of the before and after impacts. We're mainly going to focus on the beach here when it comes to Hurricane Ivan. This was Romar Beach in Alabama, so these first set of images, they're going to start from Alabama and then we'll work our way towards Florida. The image on your left was before, the image on your right was after. Not only did you have a collapsed condo, but you also had just roofs that were ripped off of these buildings. And in Orange Beach, we just saw some very intense damage, and a lot of that has to do at the beach because of the storm surge and also because of the wind. So all of these images are also courtesy of the USGS. So you have these two arrows here that will point your attention in these two different homes. And then when we go to the after effect, one of the homes completely lost its roof. And then the other home, it looks like some of the stilts actually came down, and it looks like some of the roof was ripped off as well. And you can see a lot of sand over the roadway as well. These images were just commonplace right after Hurricane Ivan. This is one of the most, I would say, frightening images when it comes to Hurricane Ivan. So this is in Pine Beach, Alabama. You can clearly see where that house is standing, and you can clearly see that you have plenty of beach there, and behind that house, you actually have a back bay. But after Ivan basically cut an entire hole through the beach, going back to the back bay and actually moving the house as well because of the storm surge. Those kind of sites were also unfortunately commonplace. Moving to Gulf Shores, more of examples of a couple of houses, and then you had a new construction right after Ivan, so that didn't really count there. But where you see the little scour, there was a house there, and it is no longer there. Now moving over towards Florida and Pensacola Beach, you have a tall condo in the background, and then you have, it looks like to be a restaurant right at the beach. Part of that restaurant completely destroyed, and when you have that high-rise condo, you have some of the walls that are completely ripped out. Because when you go up, those wind speeds probably were actually a little bit stronger than what they were at the surface. In Via Sabine, Florida, more condos, and it's more or less just more of the same. Roofs completely ripped off, buildings kind of ripped in half, and it's more of the same as we move over towards Navarre, just constant destruction. And this last image that I'll show, this is Santa Rosa Island, where there's actually supposed to be a highway that's running through this island, but as you can see, there's no island there. Hurricane Ivan, it's something that we'll never forget here along our stretch of the Gulf Coast. And the 2004 season is something that we'll never forget. And it's unfortunate that in back-to-back years, we basically had the entire stretch of our coastline impacted not only by Ivan, but also impacted by Hurricane Katrina. And also locally, when it comes to Ivan, where that 145-mile-per-hour wind gust is actually where my grandma's house is actually located. It's surprising that she was one of the only houses that was in her neighborhood that didn't flood, as she's right on the water. But Ivan, it's something that we're always going to remember. It's something that the Gulf Coast is always going to remember, and it just adds to a very intense 2004 hurricane season, Brian.
Yeah, Ivan's definitely stands out. And, you know, if you think of the Mobile area, Ivan stands out. How do locals compare Ivan to another monster, the 1979 Hurricane Frederick?
Well, Hurricane Frederick, we're at the 40-year anniversary of Hurricane Frederick, and there's been a lot of talk actually this year between Frederick and between Ivan, but the thing to remember is that Ivan and Frederick almost impacted, I'd say, two different areas more directly. Frederick was more of a Jackson County, Mississippi, and a Mobile County storm. Meanwhile, Ivan was more so of a Baldwin County and Escambia County in northwest Florida. Both of those storms had dramatic impacts, and both of them changed the entire landscape. Frederick locally is known more for its winds when it comes to just ripping trees all across Mobile County, because before Frederick, it was about 50 or so years, if not longer than that, before there was actually a thinning of the tree population here. So Frederick, a lot of the images from back in 1979 were a lot of the trees being down. There was also a decent amount of surge with Frederick, but that was more so down on Dauphin Island, where they had to completely rebuild the bridge to connect Dauphin Island to Mobile County. And then when you talk about Ivan, the main thing that sticks out is definitely the storm surge when it comes to Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, and then over towards Pensacola. So both of them, they stand out in their own right. A lot of people don't really compare the two because they were so different, but both of them really show what can happen. And Frederick, again, the 40-year anniversary, Ivan, the 15, we're hopeful that we don't have to see anything like that really ever again, but we'll always be ready for one.
Right, definitely. You know, you mentioned all the tornadoes that Ivan produced, and that's something from the market I just came from. It's something that we definitely are concerned with. How do you get that message out to people who are inland from the coast of, hey, the wind and rain, wind's not a big deal, storm surge isn't a big deal, but these tornadoes can be. How do you get that message out to your viewers?
Well, when we get that message out, it's something, unfortunately, even over the last couple of years, we've had a couple of tropical systems be low-end Category 1s, tropical storms, and from those rain bands, we've dealt with spin-up tornadoes because of that. I think a lot of people here locally are aware of the potential of tornadoes that can be found in these rain bands, especially farther inland, because one of the areas that was hit hardest, especially back during Ivan, was Atmore, Alabama, which is well a ways inland, but they were impacted by very heavy winds, very strong, by tornadoes as well, and that knocked down a lot of lumber and destroyed a lot of homes as well. So the tornado message when it comes to tropical systems, there's a lot of spinning going on in the atmosphere, and it's not a surprise when you have such low-level circulation and when you encounter it with friction elsewhere that you're going to get those spin-up tornadoes. So inland, we're always preaching for there's going to be the potential, if there is a tropical system, for inland flooding because tropical systems have so much moisture with them. But you can never let your guard down when it comes to the potential of tornadoes as well. So it's not just a coastal event that we're focusing on. And I think when it comes to expanding the coverage, you really got to focus in on the inland counties and the inland areas as well because of those same factors, because of the tornado threat and because of the flooding inland threat as well.
Yeah, I think that's something our viewers here in Raleigh also understand with us being well in from the coast as well. Thomas Geboy from WKRG in Mobile. Next time you're down his direction, look him up, our sister station down there. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. A lot of good stuff.
Thanks, Brian.
Hopefully you enjoyed our show this evening. A lot of good stuff, a couple of different perspectives, and a quick look back to the 2004 season. Don't forget, we are here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern through the Atlantic hurricane season. Thank you for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Brian Hutton Jr. Have a great evening.